Thank you for joining and welcome to Lead Dev Bookmarked. Lead Dev is a global community of engineering leaders who come together to discuss all things leadership, teams, tools, and tech. Bookmarked is our monthly book club, and our sessions cover an array of engineering and leadership books that our awesome Lead Dev audience can draw insights and practical experiences from. I'm Susan Bond, and I'm the moderator for Bookmarked. I'm a former COO of a scaling startup and a leadership consultant. My specialty is tech leaders. You can find me everywhere at my name on LinkedIn. Well, mostly not on Twitter anymore because it's X, but you can find me everywhere with my name. Today, we'll be talking about inclusion on purpose, an intersectional approach to creating a culture of belonging at work. If you have questions for Ruchika, please pop them in the Q&A feature on Zoom. I'll make sure we get to them. So Ruchika Tulshyan, hope I said that right. Did I get it? Yes.
You got it.
Okay. Got it. Great. Is the best-selling author of Inclusion on Purpose, an intersectional approach to creating a culture of belonging at work. The book was described as transformative by Dr. Brené Brown. She is working on her next book, Uncompete, Dismantling a Competitive Mindset to Unlock Liberation, Opportunity, and Peace. Ruchika is also the founder of Candor, an inclusion strategy practice. A former international business journalist, Ruchika is a regular contributor to the New York Times and Harvard Business Review, and a recognized media commentator on workplace culture. Welcome. I'm so excited to have you here. You know, I've already told Ruchika this. I kind of LinkedIn stalked you for a while. And then I said to Sean, who helps out with the show, this is who I want. Can we get her? So I'm really this is a long time coming for me. I'm so happy you're here.
That's so nice. Thank you so much, Susan. It means a lot to be in this community. I have to say that I'm always in awe of folks who are in engineering. I'm actually married to someone who is in computer engineering, so y'all think very differently from me, and I'm in awe of what y'all do for sure.
I'm married to a software engineer too, and love it. It's a great community. So what made you write Inclusion on Purpose? Where did that come from? What was the impetus?
Yeah, thank you. And it's actually exciting to be in this community because I think it just showed me, I think, I'll sort of go back a little bit and then I'll pan back forward to writing Inclusion on Purpose. So my background is in journalism and business journalism. I definitely was, love telling these stories of upcoming enterprises, a lot of startups going public, that sort of thing. Really some exciting stuff over the years. And just over a decade ago, I moved out to Seattle for said partner's job in a large tech company in the Seattle area. That's where I'll leave it. And I too made a transition into the tech industry. I was the first content strategist for a tech company that later went public. On the one hand, I loved the work that I did. It was so exciting. It was really interesting to learn about how things work and how does like what you write and how you develop as content, how does that translate to something that's seen and used by, thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of users by the end of the day. On the one hand, there was that. And then on the other was really facing some of the challenges that are very deep rooted in, certainly the technology and software engineering industry, and just really across, we're seeing it across so many. But some of the challenges of being a woman, being a person of color, being from a different country, being an immigrant, understanding what it means to have an immigrant visa, like all of these different challenges that just compounded and witnessing really what it means to, again, be part of a very high growth, very lucrative, really, exciting and future looking industry, but also deal with a lot of the real challenges that exist. And, how do you create inequity in being part of this industry. So I would say, my experience in tech was really eye-opening. And again, some of this feels dated now because this was over a decade ago, but we were not talking about what it meant to be a woman of color in tech. We were not talking about what it meant to be neurodiverse or have disabilities or be part of the LGBTQ community at the time that I was in the industry. And so as I sort of left fairly burnt out, to be honest, I started hearing again and again from people like, I have good intentions. I'm a leader, I'm a company builder, I really want to build the next big organization. But I just I'm getting stuck on this DEI, or at that time, it was really just diversity sort of issue. And so the more I heard that, I became really curious, like, what is that missing link between good intentions and impact? And as I started researching interventions, as I started researching and talking to organizations and then starting to advise organizations, it became very clear that what's really missing between that good intention, that, outcome of that impact, is understanding what are the things that are like, what are historical inequities, what does oppression look like, what are ways that we can create cultures that are more inclusive. You have to be really intentional about it. It doesn't just happen, right? Inclusion on purpose. So that's the backstory. I know, a bit long-winded, but that's the backstory of inclusion on purpose.
Mm, mm. And I'm always just curious, how was it finding a publisher for the book?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It was challenging. I think the publishing industry, there was a New York Times study, there was a study published in the New York Times about 3 or 4 years ago that said 90% of books published are by white authors.
Mhm.
And on top of that, largely even there was a movement, gosh, I can't remember the hashtag, but it was essentially, what does your advance look like, right? Like publishing
Yep.
advances, and male, even debut authors who had no sort of track record of, successful books were given much higher
Yep.
advances than women. Publishing paid me was the hashtag, I remember now. And so it was a tricky process, but I will say I lucked out because I was writing for HBR already. An agent reached out to me. That's the hardest part, I would say, actually, getting an agent, one that you really like. And mine was really serendipitous. She had read one of my articles, she had reached out, she had said, "Hey, have you considered writing a book on this topic?" And I was like, "Oh, not really." And then kind of the story goes from there. But it's a tough process. And for anyone, I don't know if this is,
Yep.
group here is interested, but for anyone who is interested, really, I would say the start is to really begin by writing bite-sized pieces of content, using levers like LinkedIn, websites, and then of course, more established media like HBR and other websites. And that's, I think, how you really build a platform towards a book.
Thank you. I think our audience does enjoy hearing a little bit about that and how did you get there. So I appreciate that. So you talk in the book about developing an inclusion mindset using the bridge framework. Can you talk a little bit more about what the bridge framework is?
Yeah, absolutely. So I will say that it's a handy acronym that I came up with, really inspired by the work that I was reading. And I mean, I was familiar with Dr. Carol Dweck's work on the growth mindset, but really going back and figuring out, making that connection between so Dr. Carol Dweck, at Stanford really looked at the difference between the growth and the fixed mindset. I'm sure folks in this community are well familiar with it, but really looking at that, at the difference between kind of being told like, or thinking like, okay, I know everything, and if I can't do something, it's because like I can't ever learn it, and having a fixed mindset versus I don't know this thing, or I don't know everything, but I can learn and I can practice and I make mistakes, but I'll get better. So looking at that difference, or looking at that approach, I started recognizing this among like clients and people and friends, and even in myself. Like I started noticing that difference between folks who, so I write in inclusion on purpose. I was teaching a class at Seattle University, and I remember the first time that my that my students, after years of running this class, one year my students were like, okay, let's get into our introductions in the class, and they were like, my name is so and so, and these are my pronouns, and I was a bit like, what does that actually mean, right? And being a little like, it's my class, I feel a little awkward, like, what does pronoun thing mean? Um, and then and then the room went around and all my students caught on really quickly. And I was the last, and I was like, okay, yeah, my pronouns are she, her, but I wasn't like sure why, right? And so understanding that there's this real hunger and real like focus on like, I may not know the answers. This may actually even make me really uncomfortable, or just because of the way I've been conditioned or the way that I've been taught to be in the world. But I can learn and grow, because inclusion at the end of the day requires a lot of evolution, and especially creating belonging requires a lot of evolution of ourselves. And I know that what's true and what we think is the way things are today will be completely different tomorrow, right? And I'm glad that we're evolving as a society, as workplaces, to be more inclusive to people. So really, I wanted to figure out a way to make that leap between that work, that amazing work that Dr. Dweck did around the, growth mindset, and recognizing that a lot of like really being a leader in inclusion, and in being a leader who believes that like inclusion is the number one most important leadership trait, would require you to have an inclusion mindset. So put simply, as you can probably see in the chat, the B stands for be uncomfortable, the R stands for reflect on what you don't know, I is invite feedback, D is defensiveness doesn't help. This is a big part of this, right? Like, I think there's part of us that often shuts down. Again, I was born and brought up in Singapore, learned very, very strongly gender is a binary. So the first time I sort of started reading about and learning about gender on a spectrum, I was a bit like, like I feel really awkward about this, and what if I make a mistake? But then recognizing that really that is how we develop this sort of traits to be a more inclusive leader, grow from mistakes, and of course, expect change takes time.
It's so great. Yeah. And we have got that in the chat for everybody. It's a great model, and there's more in the book. It's a great book. I really highly recommend it. Um, so I want to move a little bit. Getting feedback is really important for leaders. And I think it's something too that as people get further into leadership, it gets harder for them to get feedback for lots of different reasons. But I want to talk about it into a little bit more about inviting feedback around this topic, and like what are some ways that leaders can proactively invite feedback about how inclusive they're behaving or how they can improve.
Yeah. So if there was like one message that I could, uh, you know, impart into communities of leaders, it's that for anyone who's experienced marginalization or experienced moments of not really feeling welcome or like they can belong, often it's just really hard to know who's on your side in that, right? Like, and so there's a lot of good research around this concept of code switching, where people like me, for example, would change, our appearance, we would change our accent, we would change the way we sort of, what we talk about, to kind of fit into the workplace. And I think one of the things that I learned in belonging research, certainly looking at Dr. Brene Brown's research, but other researchers as well, who really say that the opposite of belonging it isn't that that the opposite of belonging isn't necessarily exclusion. It's feeling like you need to fit in, right? It's to make yourself have to code switch, have to make yourself, to change yourself, adapt yourself to the norms of wherever you are, the organization, and not feel like you can bring your whole real self to work. Like you got to hide that part of you. And so as I think about, what I wish leaders would understand, it's really like, if you have in general been welcome, if you have in general been invited, if your voice kind of carries in the room, it's to create that safety for the people who you work with, people especially who you manage, to say like, hey, I understand like inclusion isn't a given, belonging isn't a given. What can I do to make sure that you feel welcome, like you belong, that you're included here? So one of the sort of tools I write about in the book, especially around the inviting feedback part, is to really ask your people in one-on-ones and check-ins and team meetings, and certainly not in like large group settings, like going to someone and be like, you, how do I make you belong? You feel
Right.
like you belong, obviously, but really create that safety for maybe a small group, definitely one-on-one check-ins. Hey, what am I doing well as a manager? What do I do that makes you feel like you belong? What are things I can do to make you feel like you would be more included in this environment? And obviously make it sort of to everyone. It's not like you're singling people out because they're from a different background or they have a different identity, but it's recognizing that, again, that takes a lot of effort. And more than that, it takes that intentionality, right? And people are very surprised. Like when I've had managers do this, they're really surprised at the things that people gravitate to. Like for me, one of the number one things you can do, it feels so simple, so small, especially if you have a name that's familiar. But when someone takes the time to pronounce my name correctly, I immediately feel like, okay, they see me, because I've had so many years of managers, co-workers, even friends mispronounce my name. So I think this is where that like curiosity, that part, again, very much part of the growth mindset, part of the inclusion mindset is what can I do? How can I learn, right? Like what are things I should know that I don't already know to make this a better workplace for you?
Yeah, and I like that too because it's intentional and conscious, and when you ask that, because I think we can make assumptions about what
Mm,
might make someone feel like they belong. Like I remember talking to someone, they're like, "I'm standing up for people who can't speak." And I'm like, "Great. Who are those people?" And is that what they wanted? And they were like, and it was dead silent. And I said, they might want you to do whatever you're doing, but have you asked them what they want? And I think sometimes we can make assumption about what make you feel like you belong, and we might get it wrong.
100%. I mean, I do think, and this is where sometimes there is that challenge, right? Between you want to be an upstander, especially if you witness something awry, especially more than anything,
Yep.
if you have again status and privilege in your workplace, you do want to stand up. And that's, it's very important to stand up when things are extremely egregious. But I also think sometimes in doing so, we inadvertently silence people around us too. So it's about finding that balance for sure.
Yeah, and that was the point. There were people who were being silenced because they were coming to me, and I knew what they were wanting, and they weren't getting what they wanted. So thank you for that, for that nuance in there. But
Susan, I am curious. So in those
Mhm.
situations, what is the sort of advice you give people? I'm curious, and I can always share, what I think too. But I'm curious what
Mhm.
advice you gave to especially leaders who are like, because that is so much of the work that I try to do with inclusion on purpose. Like you can have the best intentions in the world, but like without understanding those nuances, it's going to be really challenging to make the difference.
Yeah, for me it was really simple. I just said, you know, why don't you go talk to why don't you go ask? Why don't you just go? I sent them right back and said, why don't you go ask? It was, listen, they were really well meaning, and I do not want to stop anyone from speaking up. It
Yeah.
was, I just said, I think it's easy, I went through a lot of coaching courses on assumptions, and it's easy for us to make assumptions about people in many different ways. So I'm a big fan of check your assumptions before you make them. And so I just sent them back and said, I would just check out and see, like, what would somebody who is maybe underrepresented or their voice isn't heard, what are they looking for? How can you really support them? Because that's what we really want. What about
Yeah.
you?
Yeah, no, I love that. I love the asking. I love the checking in, I think is really important. I know we're going to talk about the sort of shine the light concept.
Yeah,
So that was
Let's talk. Yeah, let's talk about that. Yeah, because she has. Yeah, thank you, Ruchika.
that's the
So, yeah,
perfect.
it's a great segue. So, Ruchika has a really great chapter called "Shine a Light, Get Out of the Way," which chronicles the different ways that leaders can amplify or support other voices, particularly women of color. So, let's just talk about that. You know, some of the ways that people can do that. Shine a
Yeah.
light and get out of the way.
Yeah, this is actually my favorite chapter in the book, and it's kind of led to now I'm working on my next book, Uncompete, and I would say the kernel of it really came from as I was writing this chapter. So it again came from this idea, Susan, which you beautifully brought in, which is sometimes like the answer isn't to say like I have privilege and I'm going to gonna step up and like speak up for everything, but it's really creating opportunities for people who have historically been, I know the general term we use is underrepresented. In the book I use the term underestimated because I
That
really
was
wanted
Thank you. I was trying to think of that word. I was like, what's the word? It's
underestimated.
underestimated. Sorry to interrupt you.
Underestimated. No, it underestimated. And as like I was advising someone who is a venture capitalist actually recently, and they talked about the importance of and this I was like, wow, y'all are way ahead of me here. But they talked about like historically underinvested communities, right? So it's understanding that like underrepresented really talks about people, then the onus is on people who've been underrepresented, right? And so much of the conversation are like, why aren't more women in software development and engineering and things like that? Oh, like pipeline problem, right? So a lot of the question is, a lot of the onus then is on fixing the representation issue, which indeed there is space and room for that, right? And I've been looking at amazing research from University of Washington researchers on how can you make the STEM classrooms more inclusive, especially for girls, right? And simple, like really simple interventions, like changing the wallpaper in the classroom or the design in the classroom from like Star Wars and things like that to something more neutral, just a plain classroom design or a floral classroom design or something more neutral actually encourages more young girls to feel welcome, like they can belong in STEM versus those who feel like, oh no, this is not for my gender. This is for, for males or boys or whatnot. So anyway, the point is like moving that sort of terminology of representation to underestimation, because if you also look at other research, you see that actually women leave fields like tech, especially literally like very, very technical roles, at very much higher rates than men do in the same jobs and in the same roles and in the same levels. So really looking at like, what does it feel like to bring in your full self or try to bring who you are into the workplace and constantly face being underestimated or just underappreciated, right? And understanding that the onus has to shift from those who've been historically underestimated to those who have power and privilege to make sure that there's room for everyone. So I know I kind of went down on a tangent and I'm going to bring it back to shine the light and get out of the way. So when I wrote this chapter on how do we create and how do we really elevate voices that have historically been underestimated, it was more about how do we create platforms and opportunities for people to speak up and speak their own truth, right? So again, in a meeting, if you see someone you're working with constantly be, and again, research shows women are much more likely to be interrupted in a meeting. It's to say like, okay, I know that as a man, for example, or as a white person, for example, my voice, people are going to listen. So if I say to the interrupter, I interrupt the interrupter and I'm like, I don't think Ruchika was done. Could we let her finish? And I really want to hear what she has to say rather than I think what she was trying to say and repeat that point makes such a difference, right? And it's a subtle intervention. It's a subtle difference between I'm going to finish someone's thought because they're not being heard versus I'm going to say to the person who's interrupting Ruchika and say, like, no, I want to hear what she has to say. So it's really shining the light. It's saying, I want you to be the one speaking up for yourself and then getting out of the way. And I think that subtle shift can be so powerful in creating a more inclusive environment.
Mm. Yeah, and I think in that chapter you have a few different examples of the ways that people can shine a light and get out of the way. It's a great chapter. It's one of my favorite. Um,
Actually, I'm
so
happy to talk about another one,
yeah, please do. I think it would be really
so
useful because I think sometimes we're like, but what does that mean? I have this privilege, but then what do I
how do I
do?
do it? Yeah, how do I do it? And actually, so that's where one of my favorite interventions, which I, read about now, we talk quite a bit in the DEI world about, is amplification. So a previous presidential administration, the female staffers in the Obama administration found that often they would be talked over in meetings or ideas would not get credited to them. And essentially, the men in the administration would hold court and meetings. So, what the Washington Post reported is they came up with a strategy where basically, when one woman said something, another would sort of recredit her and re-up what she was saying. So she would amplify her. So, for example, Susan, you make a fabulous point in the meeting, and I'll say, that was an amazing point, Susan. Thank you so much. And let me kind of add, and to build on that, I'm going to add blah, blah, blah. And someone else, then would be like, oh, Susan Ruchika made a great point. Here's what I need to add to that. And I think, again, what it does is it takes away, or at least creates an opportunity for more of us to be heard and credit to be given where credit is due. And I think amplification is such a small, again, a lot of these interventions, and this is what I try and, uh, impart in inclusion on purpose, that people think that DEI means, like $100,000 budget and this huge conference and whatnot, where in actual fact, and this is why it's hard as well, the real change is in those daily interventions. How are meetings run? How do you decide who's the person whose code gets reviewed and whose doesn't, right? I interviewed a software developer who had two degrees, two like master's degrees from Stanford, who was often, as a female developer, would often have her code reviewed and, not her male colleagues, for example. It's like in these interventions and in these moments, creating more belonging and inclusion, that's how you get to an environment where sort of everyone feels welcome.
I love it. It is because I think we do feel overwhelmed by it and we think it's these huge things and a lot of money. And yes, we know change can be hard. Any kind of organizational change is difficult. However, it's like there is things that we can do in those small interactions that can actually make a difference more than we think.
Yeah, I really think so, right? As I said, like when I've been asked by a leader, like, hey, what made you feel comfortable or what made you feel like you belonged here? And I was like, the way that you made an effort to pronounce my name correctly when I corrected you once the first time. And they were like, really? It's not the free snacks? And I'm like, nope, it's not the free snacks.
Not, it's never the free snacks, but we think it's the free snacks.
As we're learning, as we're learning. Yeah.
Well, we have a great question. I want to actually
Yeah.
bring up this question just, right now. What advice would you offer to a leader who doesn't identify with an underrepresented, underestimated community, but wants to create an inclusive environment for everyone? This leader is concerned about making mistakes or discussing topics that they may not have authority to address, but feels the responsibility to use its position to make a difference. Is there anything else that you might offer to this
Oh,
leader?
I love this. I mean, firstly, I promise this is not me making a plug for the book, but I try really hard to, address a lot of these conversations, a lot of these questions, and a lot of like, what can you do as someone who has workplace status and privilege and power and those good intentions to make a difference. But some of the things that I think are really important, which was very important to me as well, and in my own learning journey, is understanding that so much of privilege and power is positional and context driven, right? So I write in the book, like I certainly have privilege and power in many situations I'm in, right? And I think sometimes, again, the conversation around privilege and oppression is very one-sided. You either have privilege or you've experienced oppression. And I think that's where a lot of people actually get excluded from the conversation, because I think to some extent everyone can identify with what it's like to have privilege, like to have your voice listened to and carried, and people are like, oh yeah, I really like, I appreciate what they're saying. And I'm sure all of us can think of a time where we didn't belong and where we felt, marginalized. And it's really tapping into that empathy, especially into our leadership, because unfortunately, also research from Stanford from Dr. Jamil Zaki shows that actually there's an inverse relationship between privilege and empathy. And typically the more sort of privilege you amass, especially socioeconomic privilege, it's harder then to start empathizing with people who don't have that. So I always think of it like, for a very long time, I traveled, like coach class, on flights. And then once in a while, when I'm flown out to places now that I once in a while get to travel the first class, I'm like, oh, like you can feel that difference, right? You can understand like why you show up to, wherever your destination and you're like all fresh and all, and you're like, I don't understand why people aren't feeling this way. And then it starts to I use that example because I feel like it's a lot more accessible, and obviously it's very hard to understand to walk in someone else's shoes. But my point is that I think some of the things that make a big difference in terms of if you have privilege and positional power in the workplace, I think we really discount the importance of listening. So one of the things that really helped me is both doing my own research and reading and seeking out stories from communities unlike mine, and really trying to read and understand and really, as much as I could, get into the shoes of someone who is experiencing marginalizations and challenges that I have never, right? And I think that's really important of doing that self-education and self-awareness work. Within the workplace, I found ERGs, town halls, and resources that are put on or made available by organizations to be really valuable. And a lot of times people think like, oh, to be part of an ERG or to be part of a group of folks, you have to identify as part of that community. I think it's totally fine to go to people who are conveners and say like, hey, like, look, I'm not part of the community, but I really feel like it would be helpful and important for me to learn and listen. And you'll be surprised how many people are very open to that, right? As long as, again, I think there's some part of it is you go in and you're like, no, but I want my point of view represented as well, versus I'm going to go in and really quietly, really, really understand and listen. I'm going to be a fly on the wall and then try and absorb what I hear, even if it makes me feel very uncomfortable. And then I think the last part about making mistakes, if you're doing this work well, you're going to make mistakes. I have made many, 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 many. I've written about many in the book as well that I've made. And I think a simple, I'm sorry, I didn't mean that, or I'm sorry, I didn't intend this, and I'm going to do better next time, good enough, right? It doesn't have to turn into this huge, long thing. And I think the fear of making mistakes is so much the risk of not speaking up or not being aligned with people who have experienced marginalization and underrepresentation and underestimation in the workplace. The risk of that, of leaving people out, I would say, is so much greater than that risk of making a mistake and apologizing sincerely and learning from it.
I know somebody, I have a lot of friends who are trans, and we're talking about when people misgender them. And one of the things they said to me, I said, well, what do you want to hear when people misgender you or they make a mistake? And one of my friends said, I just want them to say thank you for the feedback.
Totally.
I don't need a big apology. I don't need anything else, but thank you for the feedback. And we're moving on. Like it's an acknowledgement. And I was like, oh, that's really great. It was a really eye-opening moment for me about what it might look like when we get something wrong or we unintentionally hurt someone's feelings or we, you know what I mean? We don't make them feel like they belong.
Totally. And Susan, I can say this also as someone whom, when I correct people, with the pronunciation of my name, what makes things a million times worse is like, oh, I'm so sorry. I'm such a fool. Oh my gosh. Like, where does, like, tell me more about you. Where does it come from? Tell me about your name pronunciation. Oh my gosh, I wish I hadn't, like, and then it turns into this whole, like, oh, I'm so cringe and I feel so awkward. And all I want to hear in that moment is, oh, okay, it's not Ruchika. Thank you for pronouncing it. Thanks for the feedback. Ruchika, let's move forward. You know what I mean? Like, and
Yeah.
I think again, in this work and, and again, from name pronunciation in the grand scheme of things, small slip up. There are much larger mistakes you can make around inclusion, but I think apologizing sincerely and moving on from it is extremely important.
I think it's really helpful. That might seem like a small thing, but I think a lot of us encounter that I got it wrong and it can paralyze us, right? I mean, you could hear in that last question, they really, they're talking about a leader who really wants to get it right and how do we get it right and what happens when we get it wrong. So love that you I love that you talked about that. I feel like that's really useful for lots of folks.
Yeah, and that defensiveness, the level of like that worry about yourself, right? Like so much of the work that I do inspired by the work of, amazing from bell hooks to Audre Lorde to like all these
Mm.
incredible, especially
Hmm.
and philosophers and leaders, is the importance of like decentering yourself if you have always seen yourself reflected, right? And that's something I talk about in my classes. And one of the things one of the most simple but profound things that a student said to me is we did I'm sure you've seen, it went viral years ago, these videos where people would do a privilege walk, right? Like take a step forward if you're,
Oh,
if you were
mhm.
income household, take a step forward, right, and take a step back if like, for example, you're a person of color, etc. And I remember one of my cis straight white male students came up to me after we did that, just as an exercise. And he came up to me and he said, thank you so much. I never thought about the fact that like one of the ways that I experienced privilege was when I walk into a drugstore, I can find band-aids in my skin color. And I was like, I can never do that. Like it's always a color that will not match my skin. And he was like, I really appreciate that. Right. And it's these little moments that we take for granted, along with the big ones. But I think it's understanding what it means to always have your point of view or your world centered and figuring out how to decenter that, especially as a leader. Right. At the end of the day, if leadership is about influencing and motivating others to bring their best selves to work, it's about how you decenter your voice and your leadership in that.
Well, and one of the ways I think it might show up too is giving feedback, right? How we get giving what like so what should we consider when giving feedback, particularly to women of color or underestimated folks when maybe let's say we're not.
I have a whole chapter on this. I think one of the
Mhm.
things,
It's a great
and,
chapter.
and then there are a lot of things that I would add that like post book that I wish I could add post production. I mean, one of the things is, culture and where you're from makes such a difference. And I think of culture in so many ways. So I appear as Indian, which I am, my ancestors are, but I grew up in Singapore. So one of the things that is really challenging and truly like a personal project that I've had to work on, like a personal, I won't say failing, but really something I've had to work on is changing my mindset or changing the way that I receive feedback, because I grew up in a culture where like saving face, the Chinese concept of saving face, is what I grew up with, right? So you would never directly challenge someone, you would never offer feedback. Feedback had to be really couched. It had to be sort of, you had to dance around it. And that's how I grew up. That's how I felt comfortable receiving feedback. And when I moved to the West, I was like, oh, wow, like this is not good fly, and receiving feedback as a personal failing. So I do think like understanding those microcultures within the way that people want to, receive feedback, give feedback is really, really important. I think one of the things that I spoke with, good friend Amy Gallo, who is an expert on feedback and conflict in the workplace, she talked about when I interviewed her for Inclusion on Purpose, the importance of saying, like, here's my intention with giving this feedback, right? And I think that's something that we often miss. So again, as managers and leaders, rather than saying like your work sucks, it's really saying my intention with this is to ensure that like you bring, that I know you have it in you to be an amazing, engineer, or like you have it in you to develop this incredible thing that you're working on. And that's why I'm giving you this feedback. So that intention has to be really clear, especially if you come from underestimated communities. A lot of times you receive feedback can be biased. It can be colored by your past experiences of working with biased managers. So even if a manager with great intentions is like, here's what you can do to improve, if you don't hear that affirmation of like, I'm here because I believe in you, I'm giving you this feedback because I know you can do better, I think that makes a big difference. There's great research and painful research around the difference between feedback that men receive versus women, right? And a lot of times women are given very vague feedback, like, oh, you're doing great, or you're not doing so well, and that's it. Whereas a lot of times men are given feedback on like, here's very specific ways you showed up as a leader, and therefore you're off for promotion. You're going to get a promotion, or like, here's things you didn't do specifically. Here are 4 or 5 ways you can improve. So really being able to check that and be able to make sure that you're delivering feedback equitably is really important.
Yeah, that's so good. We are almost out of time. So I'm going to ask one last quick question. It was so much fun. I got really deep. I'm so sorry. I can't get to the last question in the Q&A because I just want to end on the note of like, what brings you the most joy in doing this kind of work?
Such a good question. I think the number one thing is seeing those shifts in cultures, right? Those micro shifts in cultures, working with clients or talking with folks who say things like, wow, like there was a time where I could never get heard and now I really feel heard, or leaders saying, I didn't recognize that it was so important to, deliver feedback well, or to make space and make room for others and get out of the way. But those little things, and sometimes there's that awareness, which is amazing, and sometimes it's just you're sitting in a meeting and you see the way someone operates differently. That I think is really special and profound. And again, so much of this work, like, yes, there's so much to do, it's a big world and a lot of problems out there, but it's in those one-to-one interactions that that really inspired me to keep me going even when times are hard.
Thank you so much. Thank you for joining us during this session. We'll be pausing on Bookmarked for a while after today. We do love delivering these sessions for you, and we hope to be back sharing great books and even more incredible authors with you soon. Thanks again for being here.